I appreciate that, just before you guys came in. My name is Robert Scarlett. I'm your lecturer today. Welcome to the Summerville Museum and Research Center. How many people did not know this place was even here? I was one of those, right? When a friend of mine asked me to come out here a couple of years ago, I'm like, Summerville has a museum? I didn't know that, right? And we've started this lecture series about 2 years ago when I joined the museum here. And my personal specialty is I try to share the black history of Summerville. So there's a lot more black history of Summerville. And if you're interested in anything we've done over the last couple of years, if you go to our website, summervillemuseum.org, and go all the way to the bottom, there's a YouTube link, and you can watch like 12 previous lectures that we've done here. If you wanted to catch up on your Summerville history. Today is different. We're celebrating Black History Month, but I'm doing it in a much different way, kind of a unique way. Over the years here, we normally just talk about certain people from history, but now we want to focus on the struggle to become a minority-owned business person in America and in Summerville. What people had to do in order to really make it to that pinnacle of independence, which of course is economic independence, if you can get there, right? Most of us, I think it's fair to say, we're still striving for that economic independence. I would think so anyway. So, welcome to another celebration, as I was saying. Today we're going to talk about not only that history of black-owned businesses, or not black-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, right? When I talk about minority-owned businesses, I include, obviously, black-owned businesses, but also female-owned businesses. Because when you think about the struggles that they've gone through, and other ethnic groups that are listed in that minority category that we'll talk about today. Before I do all those, I want to set the stage for my main focus. Right? My goal is to celebrate Black History Month in a way that I believe the way Dr. King meant it to be done. And that is celebrating all people and the struggles that all people have to go through in the United States to ultimately get to where we all want to be, right? Economic independence, if we can get there. Right? So I believe it's fair to say that the major focus in America today is economics, AKA money. I think it's very fair to say that a lot of people are driven by that today, to no surprise at all. But we are obsessed with obtaining it, but sadly, many are obsessed with preventing certain groups from getting it. That mentality of, if you get it, that means you must be taking something away from me. And that mentality has caused a lot of problems in our country for a long time. So with that in mind, I want to celebrate the stories of a very diverse collection of people who fought through the haters and the roadblocks to achieve economic success, sometimes only briefly. To state my purpose a little more clearly, we will discuss the economic achievements of minority-owned businesses and the people who made those successes possible. I promise, as promised, I will begin with the origin of Black History Month, which a lot of people don't fully understand, and talk about why that's actually so important. In 1926, in an effort to educate more African Americans about their history, Dr. Carter G. Woodson created what he called Negro History Week. He did that in recognition of the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln on February the 12th, and Frederick Douglass, who as an enslaved man didn't actually know his birthday. But he chose February 14th as his birthday because his mother used to call him her little Valentine. So that's where his birthday comes from, historically speaking. President Gerald Ford elevated it to Black History Month in 1976. So no, it had nothing to do with February being the shortest month of the year, so we throw it to black people. No, it had nothing to do with that. But some of us have heard those rumors, and some have spread them. The achievements and economic success of black people begun with the early African societies that brought about developments. I'm talking about the continent of Africa, where you had the invention of written languages, the arts, agriculture, technology, politics, religion and music, the invention of geometry, astrology, astronomy more accurately, All this came from the continent of Africa, but we never talk about that. We never give them the credit for any of that. So why is this history important? I say it is for the very same reason why there is such a fight to keep it hidden. From where do you draw your pride? From where do you point to highlight your ethnic group's contributions to this great nation? This is why Black History Month is important. This is why Women's History Month is important. This is why Hispanic Heritage Month is important. This is why Asian Pacific Islander Month is important. This is why the acknowledgement of all groups are important. As one who has been teaching U.S. history for over a decade, I can tell you that our history books do a great job highlighting the accomplishments of white men, highlighting the inventions of white men, highlighting the freedoms and liberties provided by white men, and highlighting the economic prosperity made possible, as you see up here, the economic prosperity made possible by white men. Is there any question as to why there are so many white men who believe they are superior to other ethnicities in America? We have been told from the time they hit kindergarten that the founding fathers made everything they enjoy possible. That founding fathers were replaced by the white captains of industry to bring us the Industrial Revolution that catapulted us above the rest of the world. All of this is shared with little mention of the American Indian, who enabled the Jamestown settlement to survive, little mention of the enslaved Africans and the European women who were both purchased in 1619 in Virginia to serve the homes and to work the fields of tobacco that became America's first financial success. Yes, when we talk about the 1619 Project, we talk about when slavery first started in colonial America. But also in 1619, a boatload of women was brought in and purchased as wives to support the colony. We forget about them quite often. All right, what about the millions of immigrants who filled the factories of the Industrial Revolution and filled the ranks of America's military from the very beginning? I can attest to that. I spent 30 years in the military. Very diverse organization, I can tell you that. So we grabbed the poor from all different walks of life, trying to have an opportunity to make it in this world. So that's a very attractive feature. So where do their descendants point to when looking for a source of pride or the celebration of their American culture? That is why we have Cultural Heritage Month. Whenever you can complain about a Puerto Rican singing at the Super Bowl and say it's not an American celebration, yet Puerto Rico is an American territory and Puerto Ricans are Americans, you have a twisted vision of what makes you an American. These are the things that we continue to fight. So let's begin today's journey of discovery. It always amazes me to find successful black people in the United States during the height of slavery. One of the most fascinating and controversial successful black men in history is Antonio the Negro, who changed his name to Anthony Johnson. Johnson arrived as an enslaved African in 1621. He later gained his freedom and became so successful, he was able to purchase an enslaved African to help work his fields. Yes, there are black people that own slaves too, for various reasons that we don't always talk about. He managed to hold on to his land and wealth, even passed it on. Generational wealth. You'll hear that theme a lot today, generational wealth, and how some got it and some were prevented from making that happen. So he passed it on to his wife and his two sons after his death. But sadly, the land was eventually taken from his family, when it was ruled that blacks in America were now designated as aliens and could not own land. Goodbye, generational wealth. As I make my way closer to Summerville, I will first highlight the impressive black-owned businesses of the antebellum period, which is that period before the Civil War, and those shortly after the U.S. Civil War. It's impressive to see people coming out of slavery or in slavery, but still working toward financial independence. As shared by Dr. Clint Smith in his series, Crash Course Black American History, let's do some deeper thinking about the economic implications of slavery. My goal here is to show how black people tried to be economically independent and how America missed a great opportunity to move us forward together after the Civil War. In 1860, because of the explosion of the cotton industry, the nearly 4 million enslaved people in the United States were worth more than all the railroads and factories in the nation combined. These human beings were commodities. The labor of black people has played an enormous role in America, becoming a global economic superpower. But most black people didn't reap any of the benefits. Why? Because the vast majority of black folks were not allowed to own any property. And if they did, it could be taken away from them without them being able to do very much about it. When slavery was finally abolished, a new system was developed with the allure of black people taking their fate into their hands and becoming independent business owners of a sort. This was America's opportunity to give black people a true chance to advance. That new system was called sharecropping or tenant farming. Black people would be given a plot of land to work, and all they had to do was share a portion of the crop that they grew to the actual landowner. Sounds like a great opportunity, right? No. Black farmers entered into ironclad contracts that resulted in them and their families being in unavoidable debt due to dishonest merchants and deceptive landowners. While they owned nothing of their own. No chance at generational wealth. Just a cycle of generational debt. Let's step back and consider the impact of generations of chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is when people are property and not people. That's an important thing to understand. In which black people rarely owned any of their land. It lasted for 250 years before ending, technically at least, in 1865. Let's then consider that sharecropping, in which enormous numbers of black people continued to not own the land, lasted well into the 1950s and arguably later. This directly impacts generational wealth in the United States. If your family was able to accrue income, equity, and mobility by owning land that produced wealth-generating crops and passed it down across generations, as many white American farmers did, it would quite naturally leave your descendants in a more economically secure position than those who came before them. But black folks, despite cultivating the land and picking the crops, didn't have the opportunity to reach the financial benefits of the land. This left black families with little to pass down to their children. And this gap between white and black people is compounded decade after decade after decade. Cotton was the United States' biggest export for more than a century. That's more than 100 years of wealth creation and industry that black Americans not only carried on their backs, but were destined to never profit from. I mean, calling it a head start for white people doesn't even accurately capture it. It wasn't, just imagine this. It was like if you were in a race against someone. They started the race with chains on their feet and death threats in their ears. very easy to figure out who's going to win that race. I remember when President Trump first ran for office. He talked about how he built his empire on his own. But get this, a small loan of $1 million from his father. I'm not mad at him, I'm envious. But that's not starting on your own. We're going to talk about some folks who really started on their own. How do minorities get to do that for their families? That is where ownership comes in. And that is what my focus is on today. How can minorities build generational wealth for their families? And now I want to focus more on the positive. Those minorities who defy the odds and achieve the status of business owners. I first want to pay homage to the oldest continuously operating black-owned business in the United States, called E.E. Ward Moving and Storage Company, that started in 1881. This Ohio-based company was founded by John T. Ward, who was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. The business began with just 2 horses and a wagon, delivering runaway slaves to freedom. Today, this multi-million-dollar company operates a fleet of 45 trucks, still going strong today. Even before 1881, several significant minority-owned businesses emerged. From the early 1700s through 1863, black townships were created across the United States, where freed and enslaved African Americans started businesses and professions such as tobacconists, shoemakers, barbers, and more. During the antebellum period, with slavery dominating the economics of America, James Forten Sr., a free black man in Philadelphia, learned the sail-making trade after the Revolutionary War. He eventually bought out his employer's business and creating his sail-making business in the late 1700s, becoming one of the wealthiest black men in America. Impressive. Newspapers also provided a way for black people to own a business and to get some positive news out there about their communities. Other than Frederick Douglass's famous newspapers, the North Star and Frederick Douglass's paper, we celebrate Freedom's Journal, created in 1827, the first black-owned and operated newspaper in the United States, established in New York City. One of my favorite stories shows what African Americans could have become much sooner if we had an even playing field after emancipation. This story is another case of me discovering a positive contributor to black history in a surprising place. In this story, we celebrate the wisdom and generosity of the brother of Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederate States of America. Not forgetting that his brother, Joseph Davis, was an enslaver, but for this story, he plays the role of hero, or at least he wasn't a villain. Benjamin Thornton Montgomery was born a slave in 1819. Luckily for him, he was taught to read and to write by his enslavers. In 1836, he was sold to Joseph E. Davis, the older brother of future Confederate President Jefferson Davis. It may come as a surprise, but Joseph Davis was a kind owner who allowed Benjamin free access to the plantation library. Through access to education, which was denied to most enslaved laborers, Benjamin developed skills as a mechanic and as a surveyor, later inventing a boat propeller, but they would not give him a patent because he was black. In 1842, he opened a retail store on Hurricane Plantation. Understand, he's a slave at this time. And he opened a retail store on Hurricane Plantation, selling general merchandise to both slaves and their owners. Just before the Civil War, he and his wife Mary had 4 children, and they prospered. Early in the war, Joseph Davis fled his plantation, but left Benjamin behind, organizing and directing 2 plantations as they planted and harvested crops. Benjamin and his family later fled to Ohio in 1863, but returned after the Civil War was over and reassumed supervisory responsibility over all the former slaves still working that area of land. The Davis Bend Plantation became part of a grand experiment in freedmen operating farming, conceived by Union General Ulysses S. Grant, Special Order Number 15, an order that we know of, although incorrectly, but we know of as 40 acres and a mule. Understand that 40 acres and a mule was something that the general came up with, but President Johnson later slapped down. So for those still waiting for their 40 acres and a mule, yeah, you're gonna be waiting an awful long time. It's not coming. In 1865, Benjamin Montgomery purchased the land from Joseph Davis, who sold him the land for $300,000 with a 9-year mortgage. He successfully managed this land for 20 years. He raised 2,000 bales of cotton in 1870, the year that Joseph Davis died. Not every year was successful, but in 1873, his net worth was $230,000, placing him among the top 7% of all Southern merchants and planters, black or white, at the time. In September 1867, he was appointed Justice of the Peace for Davis Bend, making him perhaps the first former slave to assume political office in Mississippi. Sadly, Montgomery was severely injured in 1874 and died 3 years later. His sons took over the business. Now, this is where we are supposed to be celebrating an example of generational wealth in action. He dies, his sons inherit the business, ready to continue prospering in that area. But it wasn't to be done. Unfortunately, in 1881, Confederate President Jefferson Davis took legal action and repossessed the property for his own family. So despite paying for that land, they were unceremoniously pushed off the land. And Jefferson Davis got the benefit from all that cotton. Award-winning cotton, by the way. They won actual awards back then. That they didn't plant, but they got to profit from. Another denial of generational wealth. This is where, or nevertheless, one of his sons, and this is a positive part of it, Isaiah T. Montgomery, was responsible for another great story in Black history. After losing the land, he remained in Mississippi, partnered with a couple of cousins of his, and founded an area called Mound Bayou, the first all-black town in the Mississippi Delta in 1887. The town still remains today. Another example of how education opportunities can lead to success. In the early 1900s, Booker T. Washington founded the Tuskegee Institute to prepare African Americans to succeed in the workplace and beyond. But more relevant to what we're talking about today, Washington also created the National Negro Business League, ushering in what historian Juliet E.K. Walker called the golden age of black business from 1900 until 1930. With minority success, we see examples of people who wanted to hold these minorities back economically so they could maintain control of the most important path to true freedom, economic independence. One terrible example of that occurred in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, known as the Tulsa Massacre. This began when black citizens interfered with a planned lynching of a teenage shoeshine boy. Armed rioters attacked black residents, their homes and businesses, as well as cultural and public institutions in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, nicknamed Black Wall Street, one of the wealthiest black communities in the United States. It is believed that jealousy over the success of black residents led to the destruction of their town full of successful black businesses. As a result of the violence, 35 city blocks were destroyed. Over 200 black-owned businesses were burned to the ground. More than 800 people were injured, and historians believe as many as 300 people were killed, many buried in mass graves, which are still being uncovered today. Another successful prevention of generational wealth. The 1930s did not make it any easier for minorities. The Great Depression of the 1930s resulted in unemployment rates that reached 25%. But for African Americans, the rate was closer to 50%. This is still true today. The national unemployment rate is at 4.4%. That sounds like all Americans are doing pretty good right now. But let's look a little deeper. Within this rate, the unemployment rate for white Americans is 3.8%. For Hispanic Americans, it is 4.7%, while the rate for black Americans sit at 7.5%, nearly double that of whites. This trend has motivated many to strike out on their own. One of the most famous examples of striking out on your own was Sarah Breedlove, more famously known as Madam C.J. Walker. She invented a line of African American hair care products. In 1907, she and her husband established Madam C.J. Walker Laboratories to manufacture cosmetics and train sales beauticians. At the height of her business, she employed more than 3,000 people and became the first self-made female millionaire in American history, black or white. Another great example is Johnson Products Company, founded in Chicago by George and Joan Johnson in 1954 with a $250 loan. They too became a pioneer of black-owned hair care empire, famous for Ultra Sheen and Afro Sheen. Believe it or not, there was a time when I actually had something to use it on. Back in the 70s, Afro Sheen was all the rage. I'm from Philly, in case y'all can't tell, I'm not from the South. So I definitely had a nice fro, and that Afro Sheen, nice little touch. You ever used Afro Sheen before? Yeah, I got a couple. Yeah, all right. That's a beautiful thing. They became the first black-owned company on the American Stock Exchange in 1971 and sponsored the popular TV dance show called Soul Train. Although sold to a white-owned company for $67 million in 1993, it was reacquired by black investors in 2009. Most importantly, their success provided generational wealth for their descendants of the Johnson family. Another group of Johnsons, unrelated, John H. Johnson and his wife Eunice created Johnson Publishing Company in 1942 with a $500 loan secured against his mother's furniture. Do what you gotta do. Do what you gotta do to get started. They are most famous for publishing Ebony and Jet magazines. Today, black business owners own over 3 million businesses and employ almost 1.2 million people. This foundation of excellence and perseverance can be found throughout the past and present of the Lowcountry, as I transition from a national view to one more focused on Lowcountry and Summerville. Several stories come to mind. Catherine Kitty Smith, let me go back a little. This also gives me an opportunity to discuss two of our favorite Summerville examples of minority-owned businesses. The first, right here, Kathy Kitty Springs Smith Springs, circa 1828 to 1895, was a prominent 19th century biracial businesswoman. Can anybody believe that people argue that she didn't have any black in her? Can you look at that picture and say that she didn't have any black in her? Man, look like my cousin. Well, she was a biracial businesswoman and philanthropist here in Summerville who overcame racial and gender barriers to achieve success. A successful dressmaker and hat maker, she donated land and funds for community projects, including the Church of the Epiphany, the Red School, which was a school for indigent children, especially for American Indians, the Bank School, which is a black school that was created from an old bank building, and more throughout this city. The second, the gentleman on the far left, Saul Alexander. Saul Alexander was a Jewish teenager in Ukraine when he began an epic journey of escape which ended at Summerville. Saul Alexander got his start in Summerville as an apprentice tailor. By 1914, he had saved enough money to open a store along Hutchinson Square. For those that don't know, it's right down the street there. That big open area in Summerville is known as Hutchinson Square, in case you didn't know that. He got his start there, and he saved enough money to open a store along Hutchinson Square, where today we see the name Saul Alexander inscribed in the tile at the entrance to Cuppa Manor Coffee Shop, which used to be Saul Alexander Dry Goods Store. So next time you're at Cuppa Manor, look down and look up. His name is on the ground there and above in the tiles. He lived in a modest home on Central Avenue in Summerville. His friends say he was a bit of a gambler. His home featured a garden house that he used to entertain his friends, and that's the very garden house that you'll find right back here in our garden today. We have his old garden house. Now, knowing what his friends said, is no surprise that that garden house prominently features a poker table in the middle. But to the surprise of many, at the time of his death, he had close to $1 million. From his surprising wealth, a gift of more than $500,000 was designated for the establishment of a foundation, which became known as Saul Alexander Foundation. One thing I learned a few weeks ago that I didn't know, if you're in Hutchinson Square, you ever notice that Russian Orthodox church there? That little, now that goes way back, a little tunnel back there. What that was, and this was purchased by Saul Alexander, that was the black movie theater. So originally that was the black movie theater in downtown Summerville. The theater across the street that's now the Playhouse, that was a segregated movie theater where blacks could go and watch movies up top, but they couldn't exist on the bottom. So Saul created their own movie theater right across the street. He also created Saul Alexander Playground from the money from his foundation as well. So that's impressive. That was cool to learn. So next time you're walking through Hutchinson Square, like, hey, I know what that used to be. That's pretty cool. It seems that a popular business in the area was owning a dry cleaners. We often celebrate the late, great Rollin Edwards, who operated Belmont Dry Cleaners for 40 years. After an honorable yet traumatic period, go see my lecture on Rollins Edwards, traumatic period of service in the United States Army. We feature his story in an exhibit upstairs in the museum. His were not the only black-owned dry cleaners, and maybe y'all can help me out with this one. Can anyone tell me about a dry cleaners owned by Sissy Fazan and a Mr. Bing on Cedar Street, just before you get to the railroad tracks on the right-hand side where the jailhouse used to be? Anybody? I learned about that, like some of the old folks around here got to know something about that person.
Repeat the names.
Sissy Fazan, F-A-S-O-N, and a Mr. Bing on Cedar Street. So, ask your friends. I'd love to learn more about them. Another popular minority-owned business type, even today, was restaurants. In this case, we talk about two former female-owned restaurants in Summerville. I was told that in Summerville there used to be only two eating places. Eva's on Main, which was opened in 1944 and owned by a white woman named Eva Henson and her husband. As the story goes, when her husband decided that the restaurant business was not for him, Eva took full control and ran it for many years. Eva's on Main was a staple in Summerville for more than 80 years. The other restaurant was ran by a black woman. It was called Anna Helen Jenkins Kitchen. Oh. Come on, tell me about it.
She's my cousin.
Oh. Wow. Can you share anything about her or the business?
I don't remember a lot about her business, but she was my cousin.
That is fantastic. I love getting those kind of feedbacks. Wow, that is impressive. That is impressive. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. These stories remind me of the wonderfully supportive environment of Summerville that goes back to its very beginning. That's a theme you'll hear in probably all of my lectures, is my mind being blown by the opportunities presented in Summerville that were not really presented in Charleston or the rest of South Carolina. Right? Summerville has been a very tolerant community for many years, and I love that. That's one of the reasons I love speaking about Summerville. Now, these stories remind us of, or let me ask you another one. I was also told about a grocery store called Mac Michael's Grocery Store, owned by a Mr. George McMichael, located on West 2nd North Street, not far from Brown's Chapel. The business was later run by a Mr. Jackson Pringle, who married George McMichael's daughter. Can anybody confirm that story? I think I need an older audience. All right, so another black-owned business with an interesting story was Thomas Johnson Bud Wright Sr. Reminds me of the Cosby Show. Bud. Young folk, you'll get it later. So he owned and operated a meat market and grocery store in the Short Central area for 37 years after moving to the area in 1922. In addition to being a successful business owner, this African-American man served this community as magistrate for Dorchester County, holding the position for 16 years. That's still mind-blowing for me. In the 1930s and 40s, a black man being magistrate in Dorchester County. Okay, as usual, I have talked a lot about black people. But one of my favorite group of minority-owned businesses were those owned by Jewish Americans. It's been a tradition here in Summerville for many years. I've already mentioned our personal favorite here at the museum, which of course was Mr. Saul Alexander. But you don't have to look too hard to find other incredible examples. The family that seems to me to be at the front in many people's minds when I speak to them about Jewish-owned businesses in Summerville, as I talk to those families, but before I really get into this, I got to make an acknowledgement. Very significant source of this information, including the image you see, and most of the Lynch family information that comes from an article written by Spencer Lynch that appears on the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina website. This image shows Seymour Lynch in the 1950s outside his liquor store at 120 Central Avenue. In reading Spencer Lynch's family history, we learned that his grandfather, Samuel Lynch, immigrated from Poland in the 1930s. We know what was going on in Poland in the 1930s, so I'm glad he made it out. Samuel became a small business owner in the Short Central area, where he started a dry goods business and later a liquor store, soon after Prohibition. Both businesses were passed to his son Seymour, pictured here. Generational wealth. I personally love the history of the Lynch family, their tradition of supporting the aspirations of black business entrepreneurs in Summerville. The first example shared by Spencer Lynch, which I spoke about in the previous lecture, was the fact that his grandfather was one of the first individuals in Summerville willing to lease space in his building to African-American businesses. Samuel Lynch supported two barbers, Mr. Bryant and Mr. Pinckney, as stated by Spencer Lynch. Mr. Bryant's barbershop catered only to whites, only to whites. In another article I read, they give a brief description of Bryant's barbershop. It says it was located a couple of doors down from Dr. Melfi's pharmacy, my go-to source for Mad magazines. Yeah, some people remember Mad magazine. It had a New Orleans vibe with ornate shrines set up to honor President John F. Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., with other photographs of less famous civil rights icons. This was impressively bold for a business that only catered to white customers. Unlike Mr. Bryant, Mr. Pinckney's barbershop served a black clientele. It is equally fascinating that Spencer Lynch mentions the fact that one of the buildings that his family owned was next door to where the Ku Klux Klan met in the 1930s. For those who do not understand why this is significant, the KKK started in Tennessee as an organization designed to terrorize formerly enslaved African Americans to prevent their advancement personally and economically. They didn't want any generational wealth going on in the black community. But during what is known as the second iteration of the KKK, the shift to explicit and organized anti-Jewish hatred occurred with the Klan's revival in 1950. This second Klan expanded its list of targets to include African Americans, Roman Catholics, immigrants, and especially Jewish people. The KKK views Jewish people as a race apart and not truly white. They subscribe to conspiracy theories such as the Great Replacement, which falsely claims that Jewish people are masterminding a replacement of white Christians in the United States through immigration. If you remember, during the racist march in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, the white supremacists were marching with torches and they were chanting. What were they chanting? They were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." That's what they were saying over and over again during that Charlottesville march. Jews will not replace us. Despite their hatred, or perhaps because of it, many successful Jewish people willingly helped other marginalized groups in American society. By 1964, Spencer's parents expanded their business and opened a department store called Seymour's, while continuing to operate the liquor store. See some nods, some heads nodding for Seymour's. Yeah. It always gives me, I like that confirmation. My source is correct. To me, the most interesting story Spencer tells is this one. I will read it verbatim so I don't mess it up. He said, "The alcohol blue laws," ma'am, sit right up front here if you like. Come on in, take your time. I love your dress. Let me grab a chair so you can sit right next to me. There you go. Okay, so the story, like I said, I'm going to say it verbatim. I think it's pretty interesting. The alcohol blue laws created a mini industry of bootlegging. Retail liquor stores were closed after sunset and on Sundays. My father capitalized on this market and became one of the largest distributors of liquor to the bootleggers in Dorchester County. My brother and I would load hundreds of cases of half pints into the cars and trucks of bootleggers for their weekend sales. Now, that isn't a truly American story. I don't know what it is. Just as I have been saying throughout this lecture series, Spencer mentions that Summerville was a very tolerant community and welcomed many Jewish families. In his story, he talks about Solomon Mirmah, who owned land and business in Summerville. His most famous employee was a young immigrant from Ukraine named Saul Alexander. As we have mentioned several times in this museum, Saul went on to become a successful business owner and philanthropist. During the hard times in the late 1920s and 30s, Saul Alexander and another Jewish immigrant, Marcus Barchet, served as private bankers to enable the people of Summerville to buy homes. Lastly, Spencer Lynch talked about the Kramer family, who arrived from Prussia, a formerly powerful German kingdom, around 1900, and opened a produce market in Summerville on the site where their son, Isidore Kramer, later built his drugstore. Kramer's Pharmacy was a town landmark noted for its ice cream counter. Of all things. It's more hidden nods, yeah. Who doesn't like the ice cream? So I want to narrow this discussion a little further with some stories from current minority-owned businesses here in Summerville and in the Low Country. I was blessed with the opportunity to sit down and interview 3 local businesses, 2 cleaning companies, and a historic funeral home. I asked all 3 the same basic questions and enjoyed hearing those responses that were similar and those that surprised me. My first interview was with Joseph Harrison, an African-American man who once owned and operated Zeb's Quality Cleaning Service, where he started out as an employee and later bought the company and managed over 200 employees. He now owns Optimum Power Washing. My second interview was with Angela McNeil, an African-American female who has owned and operated AMC Cleaning Service for the last 35 years. I was excited to get the female perspective. And lastly, through the grace of God, and the pride of one of my students, I got to pick the brain of her grandfather. She's sitting back there now, being the Reverend Dr. H.S. Capers of Aiken Capers Funeral Home, a staple of this community since 1929. 3 different businesses, but eerily similar experiences and lessons learned. Clearly, I cannot repeat every word of those extensive interviews, but there were some themes and stories that really stood apart. First, they all emphasized the importance of providing consistent quality service. Of course, the focus of the funeral home would entail a different type of quality service. In the words of the Reverend Dr. Capers, he said, "Our funeral home focuses on trust and integrity. We treat our loved ones like family, with an emphasis on respectful, personal service, rather than one-size-fits-all offerings." Next, I focused on something that affects all businesses, which is the challenge of funding. I approached this by asking the question, what was your experience when seeking funding to expand or support your business? Dr. Capers summed it up well when he said, as a minority-owned business, they experienced discriminatory lending practices, were offered loans at higher rates, and offered smaller loan amounts, even when credit scores, revenues, and collateral were comparable to white-owned firms. They were not treated the same. For all 3 businesses, this resulted in them supporting their business out of personal savings or tapping into retirement accounts more often than through bank loans. In addition, all 3 businesses said they were not able to tap into small business support fundings offered by the government. With one exception, Mr. Harrison did manage to use some PPP funds during COVID to keep his business afloat. Nevertheless, all 3 expressed clear bias trying to get a loan from a local bank. Third, when I asked the question, how have racial stereotypes or biases impacted your interactions with customers, suppliers, or partners? The responses really captured the struggles based not only on race, but on gender and the type of business. Mr. Harrison, his struggle was with a clearly biased new contract manager at a major customer. It was clear the new manager was comfortable with a cleaning service with a lot of minority workers, but not with black ownership. He ended up losing or not renewing every contract he had with this company. For Ms. McNeil of AMC Cleaning Services, her main struggle was clearly based on gender more than race. She said, her story introduced me to a funny new expression. Y'all might be helping me. I never heard this expression before. Never. She said her greatest challenge was trailing the tail feathers of men. Trailing the tail feathers of men. Anybody heard that before?
No.
Makes sense, though.
Yeah. So I had like, hold up. I had to have her repeat it so I can make sure I got it down correctly. Never heard of it. She explained it was a stereotype that a man comes with more power and authority, whereas women represent a fluffier or weaker authority. Therefore, hiring agencies often dismissed her thoughts, talked over or passed her at bidding conferences, clearly preferring to partner with a male-owned business. For Aiken Capers Funeral Home, the issue was more pronounced. Their issues affected interactions with suppliers, partners, and service providers more than with the families that they serve. Dr. Capers mentioned that he experienced situations where his expertise or decision-making was questioned, and in some cases, assumptions were made about the scale, professionalism, or financial capacity of the business. before even reviewing their actual performance or credentials. On another front, one thing that stood out to me was the clientele difference between the types of businesses. They seem to be more critical, jump ahead. With the cleaning services being hired almost exclusively by white businesses. Much of that was because there are very few large minority-owned businesses that can afford a cleaning service. According to Mr. Harrison, he had anxiety whenever he came across a black property manager because they seem to be more critical and less trusting of a black cleaning service, resulting in extreme micromanagement. But the opposite was found with Aiken Capers Funeral Home, whose clientele is almost exclusively African American families. When I asked the question, in what ways has your business contributed to the local community? The answers varied in understandable ways. Aiken Capers Funeral Home offered the greatest example of what owning your own business can allow you to do. According to Dr. Capers, and he said they offer apprenticeships and training programs, including internships for college students interested in funerary services, mortuary science, or small business management. They collaborate with churches and nonprofits to provide resources for community development projects or emergency support programs, and fund scholarships and mentorship opportunities for youth. That is beautiful. Mr. Harrison's cleaning service, their profit margin did not allow for a lot of charitable giving, but they did donate to youth sports organizations and is a sponsor of the museum's historic home tours that we are doing in March. If you don't know, we're doing a tour of a lot of the very old Summerville homes here in March that you can sign up for and attend. That we'll be doing on March 7th and 8th, I believe the dates are, that we're doing the home tours. Similarly, Ms. McNeil said her main impact was in hiring from within the community. But what really stood out to me that was very laudable of her business is her commitment to supporting re-entry programs. Those are programs designed to give jobs and opportunities to people released from prison. That takes courage and a lot of compassion to do. My favorite question to ask was, what is the most rewarding part of running your own business, despite any obstacles? The answers were surprisingly different, clearly based on business type. Mr. Harrison said his goal centered around the desire to determine his own income potential, but admitted he had to push past the security of a guaranteed paycheck. That's a lot to give up. For Ms. McNeil, it was all about her children. She wanted the flexibility to prioritize her children, whatever their needs were at a moment's notice. The response I least expected, but loved hearing, came from Aiken Capers Funeral. Whereas the cleaning service both emphasized the joy of being your own boss and the ability to have something to pass on to your children, Dr. Capers added a very different perspective when he said, and I quote, "Being a keeper of history and dignity. You're not just providing services, you're protecting a sacred space that was created when black families were denied dignity in death. When people walk through our doors, they're trusting us with their grief, their elders, their stories. Helping families feel seen, respected, and cared for, especially when they feel broken, is an unmatched kind of fulfillment." Man, you gotta almost cry when you hear that type of purpose for having a business. Absolutely beautiful. Now, I'll close this lecture with the closing questions that I asked all three businesses. First, what advice would you give to the next generation of minority entrepreneurs? For Mr. Harrison of Optimal Power Washing, the response was simple. Be quality conscious first and foremost. For Angela McNeil of AMC Cleaning Services, it was, first of all, bet on yourself. Second, when you walk in a room, walk in with confidence, knowing that you can accomplish what you set out to do. For the Reverend Dr. Capers of Aiken Capers Funeral Home, it was invest in yourself first, through education and skill building. Learn not just the trade, but also finance, marketing, and leadership. Seek mentors who have navigated a path you want to take. Their insights save time and resources. Preserve the heritage that honors your culture, creating a strong brand identity and community loyalty. Lastly, think generationally by owning your narrative, believing in yourself, not being limited, always adapting to change, and having a willingness to pivot. You might see that on my classroom wall here soon. That's a beautiful quote that I'd like all generations to read in the future. Finally, I gave each business an opportunity to send a closing message with the final question. What do you want the community to know about your business? Mr. Harrison said that I am honest and give a fair product for a fair price. He wants a reputation that says Optimal Power Washing does what it says it will do, and they charge a fair price for it. His closing message in defense of minority-owned business communities is an important one. Simply put, you just want to have an even playing field. Angela McNeil said that AMC Cleaning Services has been around for a long time. We are a small company, but we cover a large ground. We offer a quality product and put integrity first. And simply to know that we are here, ready to serve your cleaning needs. And last but not least, the Reverend Dr. Capers of Aiken Capers Funeral Home. With a smaller staff and a tradition of one-on-one service, families often receive more hands-on care and consistent guidance throughout planning and services, especially important during emotionally difficult times. Our funeral home focuses on trust and integrity. We treat your loved ones like family, with an emphasis on respectful and personal service rather than one-size-fits-all offerings. Man, do I have to die before I go see them? Seems like somebody will just go visit. Just go visit. All right. You guys endured me long enough. As we close this Black History Month themed presentation, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said it best during his 1963 March on Washington speech. And he said, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. Thank you for attending today's presentation. Please consider donating to the museum to support our continued advocacy for this community.